Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
I call the Honourable Member Dr David Clark.
Mr Speaker, this bill represents a missed opportunity to address the well-being of children in vulnerable families. We know that the last Labor government lifted 130,000 children out of poverty with Working for Families. We know it can be done, Mr Speaker, and we know that it is a priority for the Labor Party and for several parties in this House. Unfortunately, it seems to be a very low priority, if any priority at all, for this national government. And that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy because we heard in Select Committee from many groups representing the interests of children who made it very clear that this legislation could be improved by referring to and referencing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Mr Speaker, I moved a motion in Select Committee to make sure that we considered the rights of the children so that the legislation would be targeted toward the well-being of children, so that children would be its priority, and that was voted down by the government members on that committee. And I think that that is to their shame. A second motion was moved when there was concern raised about litigation potential if we referenced that legislation. And so we put it to the vote again as to whether we should take some legal advice and broaden that scope so that there was no room for legislative action, but equally we were referencing the desire to put children at the heart of the legislation. That too was voted down. So what we have here, unfortunately, is a piece of legislation that refuses to put children at the heart of it. And that is ignoring directly submissions presented by the Auckland Coalition of Safety for Women and Children, the Child Poverty Action Group, the Dunedin Community Law Centre, the Families Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Law Society of New Zealand, the Office of the Children's Commissioner, the Equal Justice Project and Women's Studies Association. Others referenced it too, but those are significant groups that raised concern about the welfare of children in New Zealand and the failure in this proposed legislation to deal with the rights and well-being of children. It is a missed opportunity by this government. And part of that missed opportunity lies in the way in which it perpetrates the current practice. We know that 25% roughly of New Zealand's children are being raised in poverty. 25% of New Zealand's children, Mr Speaker. The way in which the new payments will be calculated in this legislation perpetrates that same problem. It is based upon a redistribution of in the current kind of sense. The officials have modelled the estimates of cost of raising a child on the status quo. And that means, Mr Speaker, we're missing an opportunity to make sure those most vulnerable children have the resources necessary to give them the opportunities that would raise them and their families in future out of poverty. It would break that chain potentially, and this opportunity has been passed over. The government was also advised on the benefits of a pass-on mechanism in the legislation, and it refused to take a position on it. And overall, we know that this legislation will be bad for women. It'll be bad for the taxpayer overall because the taxpayer picks up some additional bill, but it will also be bad for women as the burden of payment shifts on to those who do the majority of the caring. We know that the 28% threshold proposed in the bill will mean that costs will be shared between caregivers, but that we don't think that represents a fair way of doing things under the current proposal, because those who look after kids for the weekend seldom are buying the school uniforms, seldom are paying the dental bills, seldom are paying the doctor's bills, and so on. We know that those who are the majority caregivers, those who are the lead caregivers, pick up most of those costs, and so apportioning costs directly on the basis of time spent will see the majority of caregivers worse off, and we know the majority of caregivers are women, so we know that this bill is likely to mean that those women who are struggling to raise children will struggle yet more when this legislation is passed. We have concerns also in the Labor Party about the transparency of the proposed new formula. It is very hard for families to plan ahead in any circumstance. Life presents many challenges, but for those families that have separated, and particularly in acrimonious circumstances, who've not been able to reach a voluntary agreement as to how they'll share responsibilities and the costs associated with raising children, we find that they now will have to try and understand, they'll have to try and wrestle with a very complex formula. So forward planning becomes a whole lot more difficult. I saw Mr Dunn, the Honourable Peter Dunn, was on the back foot on this issue. He began by saying at the start of his talk that you wouldn't need a fancy accountant to work out the formula. Well, I contest that in fact an advanced degree in algebra might be helpful if the amount of time the Select Committee spent wrestling with this issue is anything to go by. And if we listen to what the officials said and the 15% extra time, Mr Sabin, that they suggested would be required to train up their own staff and for them to carry out their business in future, we would see that the IRD is planning for this to be a much more complex piece of legislation to understand too. So that where the Minister gets the idea that this will be transparent and simple to work with is anyone's guess. The Inland Revenue reported that it was expecting a 15% increase in workload associated with administering an area which is already their most expensive product to administer on a per-person basis. So this new solution is going to take a whole lot more bureaucracy. And we would hope that if it was involving a whole lot more bureaucracy, it was actually going to deliver a better outcome. That is by no means clear. Women are worse off, children are not prioritised, and there is extra cost involved. There are a number of other little fishhooks in this legislation. One, for example, is the burden that will be placed on employers who will receive, likely to receive requests for additional payments to be docked from employees' wages who are not meeting payments. Now, in principle, that sounds like it might be a fair thing. If employees are not meeting their obligations, then we in Labour believe that they should be encouraged to do so. However, we learnt again from officials that no immediate plans are in place to inform people that this might be happening, and we also understand they have not consulted employers. So employers are going to be expected to administer additional payroll things. They're also going to be required to take care of specific personal information that they will have about their employees that presumably their employees hadn't shared with them for some reason, cultural or otherwise. And then the employers are going to be expected to keep this information to themselves. If they don't, they may open themselves up to future litigation. And as far as I'm aware, Mr Speaker, employers have not asked for nor been consulted on these extra responsibilities that are being foisted upon them by the government. It's a government that seems determined to push more red tape onto business. In addition to the administration costs the IRD is expecting, it's also expecting that the IT rebuild will cost somewhere in the vicinity of $100 million. Now, this is to rebuild a system that is not currently working very well anyway. It's adding on to our current legacy system in the tax department. They have a plan, they tell us, to fix it sometime in the next 5 years. We've had no credible plan to see how they're going to do this. But the government is saying they're going to rebuild a little add-on to the system to make sure that they can run it. We've seen them fall over when they've tried to do this in similar circumstance with the student loan. They'll have their fingers crossed that it's only $100 million. And then, Mr Speaker, if they introduce a new tax system eventually, a new IT system, if they get around to updating our 20-year-old tax system one day, they will have to do it all over again. It's duplicated money. It's poor spending of taxpayers' money to introduce a system that is not transparent, that disadvantages children, that makes them not the priority, that makes women worse off overall, and that has fishhooks for employers. Overall, this is bad legislation. It represents a lost opportunity to address the well-being of children and vulnerable families. This government has had plenty of opportunity to ensure the bill presents a fair way forward. It's failed to generate an outcome that's fair, transparent and representative of taxpayer money. We think they could have done a whole lot better. They could have listened to the officials. They could have happily, the member asks how, they could have taken it back to the Minister, as was proposed in the committee, to broaden the purposes of the Act so that it actually took account of the welfare of children. That is what was put to the Select Committee, was voted down by the government members who didn't want children at the centre of this legislation, who didn't want children's well-being at the centre of this legislation, and who don't seem to care about the 133,000 children dependent on this legislation working correctly.
I recognise the Honourable Member Holly Walker.